Mike Carlton's book, Flagship, the Cruiser, HMAS Australia 2 and the Pacific War on Japan, had its official Canberra launch on Wednesday, 7 September 2016 at UNSW Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. The book launch was held in conjunction with a well-attended naval history workshop conducted by ACSAC's Naval Studies Group earlier in the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this special event which follows the very successful and indeed inspiring Naval History Seminar which we've just enjoyed today. This is a special event organised by Mike's publisher in order to celebrate the Canberra launch of his book Flagship, which was launched yesterday in Sydney on HMAS Canberra. Today won't be a formal launch in the sense of speeches by dignitaries and responses by authors and publishers and so on, but there will be copious refreshments, which is the one similarity with a book launch. What it will be is a much more substantive and nourishing event in every sense, because it's a conversation between Rear Admiral James Goldrick, whom you all know and love, and Mike Carlton, who you all know and now know even better because he was there during the workshop today. You don't need an introduction to either of these gentlemen, but for those who may not remember who they are, James is a former Rear Admiral in the Royal Australian Navy, former Commandant here at ADFA, and a great proponent of naval history. It was he, I believe, who launched the book yesterday in Sydney. Yes. So you've read it? Yes, good. And you certainly don't need an introduction to Mike Carlton, one of Australia's most distinguished journalists and broadcasters, and as of about 2.5 books ago, a great writer and popular writer of Australian naval history. I have read Flagship, and I'm tremendously impressed by it, but you don't need to know my views on that subject today because you've got a greater expert in naval history in the form of James, and a great expert in the history of HMAS Australia in the form of Mike. So I'm going to now retire, leave the microphone to James, but as I do, Mike, can I ask you to talk about what got you interested in writing naval history in the first place?
Well, I wanted to become a naval officer. I wanted to become one of those young men there, white patches. From a very early age, at the age of 11, I read Nicholas Montserrat's The Cruel Sea by torchlight under the bed covers when I was supposed to be asleep. And that book just got me. It was the first adult book I ever read, and I loved it. I can quote whole chapters of it, I think, sort of off the top of my head today. Lieutenant Commander George Eastwood Erickson, RNR, sat in the drafty dockside hut on the Clyde. That's how it starts, and so on. And I progressed from there, reading this up, the Hornblower books, anything, Marriott, anything you get your hands on that was naval fiction. And then I progressed further to naval history and so on. Thought very hard about joining the Navy and was persuaded out of it because I was told that it was cold, wet and badly paid, and I've never heard anyone disagree with that, with that summary. And I started to read history. I read everything, pretty well everything published on Nelson, and then I switched to Jutland. And in the course of all this, I met, I think he was then Captain James Goldrick, might even been Commander James Goldrick. Commander, yeah. And we struck up a friendship. He said, "Why don't you write about Australian naval history?" And I, with hideous condescension that makes me shudder even now as I think of it, said, "I didn't think there was very much," which was a terrible thing to say. And he gave me a frosty look and said, "I think you'll find there is." And so I started to read it. Works by people quite a few people who are here today, Tom Frame particularly, David Stevens, Joe, and started to realise the rich canvas there was there to have to enjoy. And so that's how I got into it. Then I'd also read Rowan Revette's book, Behind Bamboo, which was basically the story of Australian prisoners of war of the Japanese. And the Perth book people got a lot of space in that book for very obvious reasons. And so I was aware of the HMAS Perth story, and then quite by chance I met a Perth veteran, someone who'd returned from the Burma-Siam Railway, and away we went, and that I thought would be the book I'd write. So I did. That was Cruiser. It worked. And so the publishers asked for a second book, which was First Victory, the Sydney-Emden Battle of 1914. And then the publishers very kindly wanted a third book, so that's Flagship. And that was a toss-up. I wasn't sure whether I was going to do that or the Scrap Iron Flotilla. But as I knew, I'd done a bit on the Scrap Iron Flotilla because of Heckwaller and Perth and all that sort of stuff. I thought I'd go for something I knew little about, which was the Pacific War, and so hence Flagship.
I have to say I'm enjoying this even before I start, because this is the first time the boot's been on this foot in many years. And I always recall trying to dodge Mike asking me how much an SM-1 missile actually cost after we'd been on the radio for a weekly session from HMAS Sydney and had just done an SM-1 firing. And I really didn't want to admit just how much it did cost on radio. And Mike knew I didn't want to admit it. So it was an interesting exchange. Turning to Flagship, it really started off being a single ship, but what happened?
Well, I thought, what do I do here? I want to try and make it a bit different to Cruiser. So I'll write the biography of one ship from cradle to grave, and that naturally, I thought, should be HMAS Australia 2. So I was going to take it from her berth on the River Clyde in 1927 all the way up to the breakers yard in the 1950s and just follow this ship through that time. But it became pretty quickly apparent, as I dug into it, that she couldn't be separated from her two sister ships, Canberra and Shropshire. Canberra was built in the next yard on the Clyde. There was Australia building, and Canberra was about a couple of months behind. And their lives were intertwined, and later so too was Shropshire. As I wrote in the foreword, I think they were intertwined like strands of cable. Thousands of men served in two of the ships, some in all three, and it seemed pretty silly to try and unpick the cable. So, again, as I say in the foreword to the book, Australia leads the squadron, but the other two are pretty much, close astern. And it was a very worthwhile thing to do, because Canberra herself, the first Canberra, had a fascinating, if tragic, story. And Shropshire was there at Shropshire was our big ship at the surrender in Tokyo Bay. So they encapsulated a good chunk of the Pacific War, just these three ships.
Sticking with the ship theme, did you note anything about, of course, as we would both acknowledge, it's about the people, but about the character of each ship, or the character that developed in each ship? I'm a bit hesitant about discussing that stuff in front of a naval audience, because it's not something I know lots about, but each ship does seem, yes, to develop its own character, which can only come from the people who serve in it and perhaps the captains who command them, and it can change, the character of a ship can change overnight with a new captain who turns out to be an arsehole. We all know that, I suppose. Australia 2 was never a particularly happy ship, I don't think. She had, perhaps the Navy was never particularly happy in the 1920s and 30s. Below decks, as they say, there was a fair bit of communist agitation going on. There was the last fag end of the British class structure, which meant that quite often sailors were treated like dirt by their officers. Often humiliated with pointless orders, for example, which might amuse the wardroom. There was one order, all swinging off buoys in Sydney Harbour, and the officers would think of excruciatingly silly orders just to make the crew run around for their amusement. HMAS Australia to collect 10 cats from Garden Island, for example, and a boat would be pushed out, and they'd have to go and round up 10 of these feral cats just to amuse the officers. That sort of thing happened. Australia was also beset by the murder on board in 1942, just before the Battle of the Coral Sea. We can talk about that later if you like, but it was basically a gay murder, which many people felt forever stained the ship's reputation. There were veterans, the survivors were still reluctant to talk about it even a few years ago, because they felt that it stained the ship. And yet they were enormously proud of her as well. They called her the Aussie, and she did extraordinary things. Canberra is
different kettle of fish again. She came to such a sad end in 1942, in August 42, at the Battle of Savo, that her reputation really was forever sullied, and unfairly so. I don't know how much you know of the Battle of Savo, but basically an Allied squadron was of cruisers, a few destroyers, was jumped by the Japanese, taken totally by surprise. And it's pretty conclusive now that Canberra was torpedoed by an American destroyer whose captain just lost it in the heat of battle at night. But when when Canberra survivors got back to Sydney, they were upbraided by an admiral who told them they'd been ghastly failures and what a shame they'd brought on the Navy and the ship and so on, which was grossly unfair. The captain himself was killed, Frank Getting. He had done nothing wrong. He'd behaved by the book and yet lost his life and the ship. So that was worth looking into as well. It was worth, I think, resuscitating Canberra's reputation. Although I wasn't the first person to have thought that by any means. Bruce Loxton, who was a midshipman on the bridge on the night, later became a Commodore, devoted most of the free hours of his remaining life to rehabilitating the reputation of the ship. And it was he who proved, I think, conclusively that Canberra had actually been struck by one, if not two, American torpedoes. Shropshire was another proposition. Again, she was a dud. The British gave us, very generously offered us a similar cruiser to replace Canberra, and they said, oh, the Royal Navy said, yes, you can have Shropshire. There was a good reason for that, because Shropshire, at anything over about 25 knots, started to vibrate like an old truck. An horrible old thing, so they'd never go full clip. It wasn't until she got to Australia, when we took her over. We took her over at Chatham, I think. And they were trying to work out what was this, and it was Australian engineers who discovered that a port hand gizmo of some sort had been stuck on the starboard shaft. I don't know what it was, some sort of thing that holds the shaft in place. It was a port hand fitting that would be bunged on the starboard shaft, which was causing the vibration. And when they changed all that over, the ship ran like a sewing machine ever thereafter, which they never hesitated to stop pointing out to the Brits. So they loved doing that. And Shropshire went right through all the kamikaze campaign unscathed and was largely regarded as an incredibly lucky ship. One of the great stories, I mean, the kamikazes kept coming at her in Australia, and they kept hitting Australia, and they kept missing Shropshire. Shropshire kept shooting them down. There was a bloke on board, I think he was a leading seaman, named Roy Kazali, and he was a pom-pom gunner, and he was a master of the art of shooting down Japanese aircraft. Roy Kazali, leading seaman Roy Kazali, was the son of the great Roy Kazali, the AFL player, the AFL legend. And it was reliably said that Roy Jr. had his father's reflexes and could shoot anything and hit it at lightning speed. And it seems apparently to have been true. Guy Griffith, who was in the ship at the time, says that was indeed the case. Kazali saved them all dozens of times. To the point where he was actually called up to the bridge by the captain eventually, a British officer, Captain Nichols, who said, leading seaman Kazali, when I give the order to ceasefire, you really must stop shooting. And Kazali said, no, sir, not if I reckon I can hit one of the bastards, I'll keep going. And he did. So Shropshire emerged unscathed and was there at the ceremony in Tokyo Bay.
That last vignette, I think, brings me to my next question, which is, who are the personalities who most impressed you for good and bad in the story?
My particular favourite turned out to be, and this is just, there's no particular reason for this, but just the person I liked and admired most, oddly enough, was Émile Deschenaux. Because I knew almost nothing about him except that there's a submarine floating around with a surname. I then met his son, Commodore Peter Deschenaux, who'll be known to many of you. But I knew nothing of what he'd done. I knew he was killed in 1944 at Leyte, and that was it, and that's why I got his submarine. I happened on his performance at Dunkirk, which was quite extraordinary. He was, I think he was a commander then. He'd never been in command at sea. He was a torpedo specialist. He had all sorts of clever things at the Admiralty and was highly regarded. And they gave him a destroyer build at Newcastle-on-Tyne. They gave an Australian officer, Australian commander, who'd never commanded a ship before, a brand new destroyer to stand by while she was building in Newcastle. So he must have had something going for him in the eyes of the Admiralty anyway. So Dunkirk is underway, June 1940, or May 1940, whatever it was, May 1940. All hell is breaking loose, and he gets a message, report to the Vice Admiral Dover, forthwith. So he packs a bag, catches a train down that night, wartime Britain, 2 trains, and he arrives at Dover the next morning, goes up to Dover Castle, and says, well, here I am. And of course, nobody knew who the hell he was or what he was there for. So, Captain or Commander, if you just wait outside for a bit. Eventually, they said, if you look down there in the harbour, you'll see a destroyer, HMS Vivacious. Take command, go and bring the troops back. So down he went. HMS Vivacious was anything but. She was in it. He was horrible. Her captain had had a nervous breakdown under the constant bombing and so on, so they had to get him ashore. And Duchesneau took command, didn't know any of the officers, had barely been, this was one of the old V&W class destroyers. We had them, they were the bulk of the scrap iron. He'd never served in one, barely set foot on one, even though we had them. So he takes command of a destroyer, takes command of anything for the first time in his naval career, takes command of a destroyer who he barely knows, and sets off back and forth, pulling people off the beaches at Dunkirk, which he did extraordinarily well. Rescued several thousand of them with fabulous combination of courage and seamanship. Writes home to his wife, and he's describing aerial battles and dogfights above them between Spitfires and Messerschmitts and strafing and bombing raids and all that sort of stuff. Writes home to his wife, got a bit of shrapnel in the seat of my pants as we were heading home. Thank Christ we were heading west, not east. And he turns out to have been a very appealing, he was quite reserved and sombre, but I think a very appealing man. After all that, he got his destroyer built, and he spent the rest of a year or so chasing German E-boats up and down the Channel, which must have been interesting. Then he got command of a destroyer, which I think was Warramunga, and then they gave him Australia as his first cruiser command, which didn't last long because he was mortally wounded on the bridge. But he must have been a really interesting man and a very good seaman and a very good officer, and I liked him a lot. The other one who came out better than I expected, oddly enough, was Farncombe, who's never been all that popular. Farncombe I don't think he was a particularly warm character. He wasn't particularly convivial in the way that, say, Collins was. And I've heard, there are a lot of bad stories told about Farncombe. His aloof behaviour and so on and so on. I grew to like him immensely after the murder trial on board Australia, where he was a ship's captain and he was also the prosecuting officer at the trial. And he secured the conviction of the 2 stokers who'd stabbed one of their messmates, and he secured that conviction. The automatic penalty for murder then was death. It wasn't in this Royal Australian Navy, the penalty wasn't death, but it was in the Royal Navy, and at that stage Australia was still under the wing of the British Admiralty. Farncombe could have quite legally have taken the ship to sea the next morning and dropped them off the mainmast if he'd wanted to. There's no appeal from a court-martial, but he could have done it. Instead, he went down to his cabin that night and wrote a lengthy appeal for clemency addressed to Navy Office, explaining the circumstances of the killing as best he could. It was a gay murder. Nobody quite got to the bottom of it. And the real expert on this is James, who did a thesis on it for his MA. Yeah. And Farncombe made an eloquent and thoroughly decent appeal for the lives of these 2 men to be spared. And he wrote a beautiful letter, which he knew was going to be read by admirals and Navy officers and so on. And it was humane and compassionate, and he understood the plight of these young men separated from... One of them was an orphan, the other one was young and impressionable. and he hinted, the homosexuality never came up with the child, never mentioned it. But he hinted at it in the letter he wrote, that the unnatural circumstances of war and young men cooped up in, the most frightening conditions and so on had perhaps led to an abnormality of mind in these two. So he made this eloquent plea for clemency. And I respected him immensely for that, because it was a very fine gesture by a commanding officer. Is that fair? You know more about the murder trial than I do.
I would agree. I think it's a remarkable letter, and how he's stepping around the issue but trying to convey it is remarkable.
Because homosexuality then was a crime. You go to jail for the abominable crime of buggery, as it was then called.
Given that we're at the Academy and given some of the audience, can I ask you, did any of the very young officers, and I think not just the midshipmen, but knowing that I think Guy Griffiths, by my reckoning, would have been 21, going on 22 at Lingayen Gulf, and David Hamer was 23. Any of the very young officers impress you?
Hamer himself was impressive. He was obviously a very skilled officer. I can't remember what. I think they were a class of 38. I think they probably were. Hamer wrote a memoir, a private memoir, which he was aggressively candid and about people he didn't like. He turned out to be a great part of the Navy. He was an impressive figure because he graduated from midshipman and entered the war as a lieutenant and a gunnery officer. Performed great deeds of daring do. At one stage, he's standing up in the fighter plot or whatever it was called at the time, standing on a table, shaking his fist as a kamikaze flew over him about 10 metres above his head. It was a colourful, daring do thing to do. There were lots of very impressive young officers who did impressive things. Hamer was but one of them. Guy Griffiths was another. Guy Griffiths had the most extraordinary war. He was one of 5 Australian midshipmen in the battle cruiser Repulse when she was bombed and sunk by the Japanese with Prince of Wales in 1941, December 41. He escaped the sinking by only just managing to squeeze out of a scuttle, and had the good sense to put his shoes on. So when he went down the barnacle-clad side of the battle cruiser, he kept his feet together. He then ended up swinging off a buoy in East Africa for a bit in a battleship. Then he was in destroyers in the Channel for a bit, and then ended up in Australia, in Shropshire. There was another young officer, Mac Gregory, who some of you may have seen his blog. He's dead now, but his blog still exists on the internet, and it's a fabulous read because he was a collector of story and anecdote and history and so on. And he was marvellous. His father had been a petty officer who had been a factotum for various chiefs of the naval staff, as they were then, and these chiefs of the naval staff who rather liked the petty officer said, "Look, why don't you put your boy into officer school?" And got him in. And Mac Gregory did the war well too. He was officer of the watch in Canberra. He was a sub-lieutenant, I think, then. That night, when the Japanese jumped them in the Battle of Savo, and he narrowly survived as well. He'd been up. I think he'd been up in the gunnery director tower or something like that, and had discovered the height of the battle and the ship sinking, it's in flames and Christ knows what's breaking. He realised he's left his cap up there, which had on it a proper badge purchased at Geeves of London with proper gold bullion on it, instead of the tin printed things they were issuing fresh new officers. And the height, he climbs up and he goes and rescues his bloody hat, which I thought was a wonderful story. So, yeah, there were bright young officers and bright young sailors.
And one of the other things I think has really taken your interest is the home front. What was your feeling about the families left behind?
What I tried to do with all the books is to recognise that it's not just about sailors, because they all had wives or husbands or daughters or fathers or whatever and so on and so on. And that you cannot write naval history, particularly in wartime, if you leave them out. Because they too are fighting the war in a different way. They're the ones who are staying at home. And it wasn't just a 6-month deployment in those days, and particularly in the First World War, you were gone for the entire bloody duration. The crew of Australia 1 and, didn't see home for 3 and 4 years. It was a little better in the Second World War, but not much. So you've got to do two things, I think. You've got to put, I'll talk about flagship now, you've got to put those 3 ships in the context of the times, not just the fact that the Japanese were attacking, but what people were doing, what they were eating, what they were thinking. In 1942, Australians lived in great and genuine fear of imminent invasion. We were convinced that we were to be invaded. And with very good reason. I mean, the Japanese had taken Hong Kong, China, French Indochina, Burma. They were on the gates of India. They got Malaya, all the Dutch East Indies. Who was next? So you have to place that. You have to write that to put in context what was happening in the ships themselves, and that's fabulous stuff to write, because it does portray. Or it does picture an Australia which I think is barely understood by today's kids, today's generation. And if you can do that, then you've added texture and life to the history of the ships and the men themselves.
I think that's going to be it for me for questions, but I'd like to throw it open to the audience, if there are any.
Anyone?
Thank you, Susan. Don't feel you have to.
It's 2 parts. The first one is, did you read J.E. MacDonald, though?
Yeah, as a kid, I read Gimme the Boats, I think, was the title of one of his books, you may well remember, Gimme the Boats. I can't remember a lot about them, but yes, they were part of the library, yeah.
I remember going to a fete and buying a box of them, I think maybe all 50 or however many he wrote, and they had gold-coloured covers on them, and they were pretty dreadful, and they smelt of nicotine. They were the ones I had anyway.
Yeah.
My question is, was there a sense amongst those who served in these ships that they were cruiser men, and that somehow they were set apart from the rest of the Navy? That's my first question. And the second part is, in terms of after the war, in the ex-service associations, how did they understand themselves? If they'd been in, say, Canberra and Australia, did they see themselves as having to choose? How did, in terms of them seeing their own service, did that work its way out?
First question, yeah, they serving in cruisers had pluses and minuses. The pluses tended to be, certainly before the war, the accommodation was a little bit better, especially for officers. It was a bit more spacious. There was a little bit of room above you, between your head and the deck head and all that sort of stuff. That was a bit enjoyable, and you were a bit special because you got plum assignments. You turned up for the Melbourne Cup and the Brisbane Show and all that sort of stuff. That was okay. On the other hand, cruisers were a bit more spit and polish. There was more often than not an admiral floating around up the back somewhere, and you were expected to be a bit more spit and polished than a vulgar destroyer sailor. So there was a bit of that. Eventually, they became very overcrowded. I mean, the peacetime complement was about 650 in a cruiser, but it got up over 1,000 by the time they'd tacked on extra guns and bits of radar and all that sort of stuff. And they weren't that comfortable. They were stinking hot in the tropics. There's no air conditioning. Being British built, there were very, very few bathrooms, for example. That was unpleasant. And there's a wonderful story of the ship's company, Australia Ships Company ashore in Devonport. Carted onto the parade ground by the RN base commander who says, you will find in the Royal Navy, you'll find you Australians, you'll find that cleanliness is next to godliness, and you will have a bath whether you like it once a week or not. So the cruiser service was a bit different to destroyer service. Heck Waller, for example, said he always enjoyed his time in destroyers much more than a cruiser command because he knew everybody in the destroyer and he didn't in a cruiser. After the war, how did they select their ship associations? I honestly don't know the answer to that. Because often men would have served in 3 and 4 ships, and yet they would cling to one as their special ship. For example, the crew of Perth, the 300 odd, whatever it was, survivors of, although many of them had served in other cruisers and destroyers and God knows what else, they always saw themselves as Perth men. There's a very strong Canberra-Shropshire Association still going today. The Australia Association, probably not so strong, but I don't know how they chose. I don't honestly know. Often it was probably a question of personalities.
Can I ask a question? You alluded to the conditions that the lower deck enjoyed, and this book seems to hint at the transformation from a classic RN-style lower deck to a different, perhaps characteristically Australian type of service. Shropshire, which gets the first cafeteria-style messing arrangements.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that sort of class dimension of their service?
Well, with the sudden explosion of personnel during the war, and we ended up at the end of the Second World War with the world's fourth biggest navy, partly because the Japanese and German navies had been sort of rather shot to pieces. I mean, that sort of put us up the rankings a bit. But all of a sudden there were tens of thousands of people in the RAN who were not used to RAN discipline, and they weren't going to cop a lot of it. They had to cop a fair bit, obviously, but they weren't pre-war, either officers or sailors. And so a little more democracy did begin to infiltrate the joint. I think possibly the presence of the Americans may have done a bit of that too, Americans being slightly less formal about it all than the British. And slowly that cultural transformation began. But it was happening in Australia too, in the country, I mean. After the war, it all changed, and you could no longer run the class. The Navy could no longer run itself on the class system as it had before the war. God knows they tried to, but it simply wasn't going to work, and democratisation began to creep in.
Following on from that, you mentioned some fairly untidy relationships between officers and sailors in the 20s and 30s. What was the relationship like during the war? Did it accommodate the change in circumstances or not?
It varied as it always does, I think, if you've got a good captain. And one or two of those captains were absolutely beloved. Nichols of RN captain of Shropshire was godlike figure. And seems to have been one thoroughly competent officer and two, a thoroughly decent man who spent his entire waking hours patrolling up and down the ship, you know, from stem to stern, top to bottom, chatting to people. He was absolutely revered by his crew. Collins and Farncombe, not so much. They very much liked Black Jack Armstrong, who was he was the commander at the start of the war. A sort of lean, piratical figure. He ended up as a ship's captain. He was widely liked and admired for his seamanship qualities and his qualities of leadership. Although his senior officers didn't like him very much, Collins didn't like him all that much and ruined his career in the end.
No, that's not true.
Is it not?
He was down to be captain of the Sydney, but he actually broke a limb trying to catch a tram.
Yeah.
It turned out he actually had a bone disease.
Oh,
Made him
okay.
unfit for sea service.
There's a suggestion that Collins didn't like him.
Now, Collins might not have liked him, but Jamie Armstrong was going to be captain of the Sydney.
Yeah, he's certainly marked out for carrier captains.
And he would have got on from that. So.
He was well liked as well. So where was I? I think I probably answered the question, yeah.
That just about gets us wrapped up. Look,
Thank you.
Can I say on behalf of everyone, Mike and James, thank you very much for writing the book. Thank you very much for launching the book and discussing it. I've read the book, but I learned stuff this afternoon because of your gloss on it. So thank you.
Thank you. I
thanks for coming.
should return thanks to people like, well, James, who got me interested in the whole thing, David Stevens, who sits on the desk there, the trouble you go to him, Tom Frame's book, particularly No Pleasure Cruise, which is a history of the RA, and up to, can't remember where it ends, but certainly beyond any period I was ever in. It was an absolute Bible too. And that's not a bad pun, Tom. So I suppose in a sense historians all feed off each other to some extent, but you gentlemen have been, port and starboard hand lights for me as I sort of find my way down the channel. So
Well,
thank
let's
you.
all thank each other. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, James.
Based on naval records, diaries and interviews with the handful of remaining survivors, this book vividly brings to life our great sea battles of the Second World War in the Pacific, and also the private hopes and fears of Australia's crew, even encompassing a disturbing murder aboard ship. Flagship is the third in Mike Carlton's series of Australian naval military histories, which include Cruiser and First Victory.